Today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast, slavery, polygamy, and genocide, the wrap-up. That's coming at you today on the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. This episode is brought to you by the Scholars and Fellows of Jacobs Premium. Hey everybody, don't forget, join Jacobs Premium to access exclusive content and our monthly book club. Visit the NathanJacobsPodcast.com and see description below for details. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. As always, thank you for tuning in. All right, so those who follow this podcast know that we have been doing a series on slavery, polygamy, and genocide. And I believe in the first episode, I probably did say this. I jumped into it and with my grand enthusiasm, I'm going to cook through this in a single episode. I actually said that. And instead, well, here we are doing episode 4 as the wrap up for our 4-part series. So anyway, we'll see where the poly markets are at. In terms of the prediction on that one. Best of luck to you all. I hope somebody won big on the number 4. So there we go. But on today's episode, what I want to do is I want to go through some of the loose ends, as it were. So if you've listened to this entire series, basically what you've heard is you heard in episode 1, I dove into slavery. And in that topic, what I did is I tried to lay out basically, first of all, the moral case against slavery. So my interest was to actually say, look, a lot of times when people will talk about something like racism or slavery or whatever it is, it's just presumed prima facie. This is obviously wrong. And not much talk or thought is even given to why. What do I mean when I say it's wrong? What is it that makes it wrong? And so the first part of that episode was really aimed at trying to dig in on the specifics of what I, as an Eastern Orthodox Christian philosopher who's an advocate of both realism and natural law, what is it that I mean when I say that something is right and wrong, good and evil? And then specifically taking that and applying it to slavery, what I did is I walked through 5 traits that I think most people think of when they think of slavery, these sort of reflexive ideas that come into mind having to do with things like coercion, abduction, psychological and physical brutality, and so on and so forth. And I went through and I made the case why, when we consider those things from my sort of realist natural law perspective, what the moral case would be against those. And I made the case against slavery, arguing that, in fact, those 5 traits of a thing that we call slavery actually are morally repugnant and morally impermissible. And then what I proceeded to do is to ask the question of whether or not that is, in fact, what is found within the Bible and within early Christianity. And what I did is I drew a distinction there between, on the one hand, slavery, the sort of thing that is indicative of these 5 traits, and something else that we might call servitude. Now, the reason I did that is because I wanted to identify a different type of arrangement that could be had. Now, after describing this other type of arrangement, this arrangement that is morally permissible, I asked 2 questions, right? The first question is it morally permissible? And I made the case that it is, because it's freely entered into. It doesn't involve coercion. There are actually physical limitations placed on this sort of arrangement that says you can't harm me in certain ways, and so on and so forth. And it suggested that that would actually be a morally permissible arrangement. So that was the first question. The second question is, would that second relationship, that second arrangement, actually be slavery? Now, rather than bantering about the proper sort of boundary lines of the word slavery, I just acknowledge the fact that most of us have these 5 traits, these 5 immoral traits just come to mind reflexively when we hear the word slavery. So I thought it best, for the sake of argument, to go ahead and semantically separate those. And let's call this other one that's morally acceptable, let's call that servitude, and let's call this one over here slavery. And that way, at least we have a clear delineation in our mind between those 2 things. And I made the case that when it comes to the Mosaic law, the Old Testament law, what it calls slavery, what translators typically call slavery, actually doesn't carry those 5 connotations that we talked about. And for that reason, we should probably actually try to conceptually and semantically separate them. And I made the case that the thing that you find in the Old Testament is largely servitude and not slavery. And so that was my way of suggesting I actually would reject the case that the thing we're calling slavery, the thing that we find immoral, is just prima facie present in the Old Testament. Just because translators use that word doesn't mean that that is actually an accurate representation of that. And then I proceeded to go on and look at how the early Christians talk about this. Because once again, in the New Testament, you have translators using the term slavery. And what I showed is that within the church fathers and within the early Christian church, there was a very clear delineation in the mind and in the teachings of the early Christian church that said, look, this sort of thing over here that we call slavery is morally impermissible. The Christian should not participate in that. The Christian is prohibited from behaving that way and having an arrangement like that. And the Christian should proactively work to actually liberate slaves from that sort of relationship. Now, as for this other thing that we're calling servitude that is morally permissible, that's acceptable, but it's actually mandatory that the Christian conduct himself in a manner that is actually morally upright. And it was very clear. I shared all sorts of examples like from Lactantius in the Apostolic Constitution to show that the Christians were very insistent. You can't even reprimand a slave in anger, right? You have to do it in the way like you would a child where you're concerned about that person's good. You have to do it from a place of love, and your goal is to win them over by conducting yourself toward them as if you were Christ, right? Loving them and caring for their soul and so on and so forth. So I suggested that within Christianity, there's actually a strong prohibition on slavery. I even showed how Gregory of Nyssa makes the very same natural law arguments against slavery that I do. And in terms of the actual instructions given by the fathers to the early church, it's to say this sort of thing that we're calling slavery, absolutely not acceptable, morally impermissible. You cannot engage in it. And as for the sort of arrangement that the Christian is allowed to participate in, it has to reflect this other sort of moral trait, this moral uprightness that is indicative of the fact that you are equal in dignity as human beings, that you are brothers and sisters in Christ, that you are to operate in love toward one another, and you are not to engage in the sort of immoralities that we associate with slavery. All of that's to say is that my case was ultimately saying that you don't really find slavery as we think about it in the Old Testament, and you certainly find a strict condemnation of slavery as we think about it within early Christianity with very clear natural law bases for it and mandates that Christians are to conduct themselves in a morally upright way, never engaging in the sort of immoralities that we would identify with the word slavery. Now, as for the case in terms of polygamy, I started once again with the question of what is meant by right and wrong, and I started with the natural law case. Now, what I actually showed is that the natural law case against polygamy is not immediately obvious. On the surface, it sort of starts off looking like maybe it's morally permissible, but I went on and I built my case from a natural law perspective for why polygamy actually is contrary to the natural law. But then where I went to the stronger claim is actually to say that no, within Christianity, it clearly is something that is condemned as something that is immoral and contrary to the order of nature and contrary to the designs of God. As for its presence within the Old Testament, what I suggested is I actually built the case that suggests that under something like the doctrine of double effect, what you find within the Old Testament is an acknowledgement that this is suboptimal. This is actually not the way things are meant to be. But given the realities of the ancient Near East, the problem was that oftentimes the dichotomy that somebody faced was between being, say, a prostitute or being raped and murdered, or being a concubine, taking a lesser stature as a second wife. And within that situation, I basically built the doctrine of double effect case in order to say that within these conditions, it's morally acceptable, it's morally permissible, even though it is not actually good or upright. And that's one of the reasons why, as culture and societies advance, Christianity makes a concerted effort to go ahead and dispel the practice of polygamy, precisely because if it doesn't have to be practiced, it really shouldn't be practiced. And so I built that case there. And then finally, in our third episode, we looked at genocide. And I made a few different arguments here. First of all, I made the case that when you're talking about genocide in the Old Testament, Again, this is the importance of defining terms. We're not really talking about genocide if you're talking about identifying a certain people group, right? As if this is sort of a racial or ethnic cleansing that's happening. And what I did is by looking at the context of these stories within the Old Testament, reading them on their own terms, I showed that when you're talking about a group like the Amalekites, you are really talking not about an ethnicity so much as you are talking about a body of practices that are deemed to be an abomination. And I walked through how, in a narrative context, you and I intuitively understand that there are certain instances in which you're going to say, man, you got to wipe them out. And I walked through a number of those sorts of stories and provided the sort of biblical lenses and patristic lenses that you might need in order to process that sort of thing, in order to build the case that even though on the face of it, when you hear leave none alive, that strikes you as morally problematic, there are certain narratival contexts in which you find yourself actually saying, like, no, that's what needs to be done, even though it is a great evil. And so I walked through a number of that. I also walked through a number of things on the theological side having to do with providence and how this squares with the love of God, is concerned for the good of men and all that sort of stuff. So anyway, we walked through all of that. That was the march through that we just went. So why a fourth episode? Well, the reason for the fourth episode is just that there are certain loose ends that were not tied up, and I anticipated these. So with regard to slavery, I knew that there would be certain mandates within the Old Testament law that would come up as saying, okay, even if this is not the sort of practice that reflects these 5 traits that you laid out, aren't there still some repugnant practices here? And I think those are legitimate questions. So knowing that that would come up, I anticipated that we would spend another episode touching on that and tying up that loose thread. The other thing is also with genocide. One of the things that listeners actually noticed is I didn't talk much about the slaying of innocents. And that, of course, is probably the most troubling part about this. Even if we can sit here and we can weave a narrative and we can look at it and say, yeah, I can understand how in this road warrior type barbarian context, you'd have to say it's us versus them and we need to wipe out that group. Okay, I can get on board with the idea that there are circumstances in which that might be my instinct. But the slaying of innocents, man, I don't know that you can get there. And that is, again, a very important and valuable question. So rather than dealing with those loose ends throughout the series, what I wanted to do is build the initial case, the very cases that I just walked through, and then in this episode, tie up the last of those loose ends. So what we have in front of us is looking at these sort of lingering questions that are there, specifically with genocide and with slavery. I don't know that anything really emerged with regard to polygamy. So I think we're all good there. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into loose ends on slavery and genocide. And actually, let's go ahead and reverse it. I actually want to start with the genocide loose ends first. Now, I should say before I dive into this is obviously part of a series. So if you haven't listened to the case that I've already made with regard to these topics, you might want to jump back and do that. But, I suppose hypothetically, without listening to that, you might be able to hang with this. We'll see. Anyway, so jumping into the genocide question. So in my previous episode where I walked through this motif of leave none alive, I built the case that there are actually certain situations in which you and I would actually have the intuition, the moral instinct even, to say like, no, the best course of action is actually to slay this group of people. And it wouldn't actually strike you as morally problematic to do it. It might be something that is an unfortunate evil, but perhaps a necessary evil. There are those circumstances in which you would find yourself actually agreeing with that. And that was largely the case I made there. However, of course, as I noted, I was largely silent with regard to the question of innocence. That is a bridge too far for the majority of people. Even if you find yourself saying, no, this sort of group of barbarians is just too dangerous that we need to actually take them out. You don't find yourself saying, and let's also slaughter their infants. You would probably be more inclined to say, let's adopt them, let's take them in, let's try to find them home, something like that. But you wouldn't go ahead and say, well, just because their parents need to be taken out, let's go ahead and bash those babies against the rocks. That's obviously a reference to the psalmist, for those of you who know your Bible. And so, of course, that one is the one that really strikes us as morally problematic when we wrestle with this question, and rightly so. I completely get that. Now, even though I did remain largely silent on the slaying of the innocents within that episode, I did touch on it in a couple of places. The one was in the context of Nineveh, and the second was in the context of the slaying of Agag, when Samuel undoes Agag, the king of the Amalekites, who Saul kept alive. Now, one of the things that I pointed out in this context was actually that you find the God of the Hebrews is deeply opposed to and distressed at the contemplation that innocents might die as a result of the sins of their parents. And I pointed this out with regard to Jonah, the very fact that when God is talking about Nineveh, he sends Jonah to go and preach to Nineveh in order to try to get them to repent so that he doesn't have to destroy them. And in the final dialogue between God and Jonah, God illustrates his point, a point that he thinks is very important for Jonah to understand. God causes his plant to spring up and provide shade for Jonah because it's hot. And Jonah is very fond of this plant because, yes, it has provided shade and a little bit of relief. And then God sends a worm to go ahead and eat it. And now the plant dies. And now Jonah's pissing and moaning. And God says, look, you're upset about a plant that sprung up in a day and then died. How much more should I be concerned about the people of Nineveh? And then, as I pointed out, he adds to this that is filled with people who don't know their right hand from their left, which my understanding of that idiom is that you're talking about infants and many cattle. God doesn't want to destroy the animals. God doesn't want to destroy the infants. And then similarly, with regard to Agag, what you see is that when Samuel goes ahead and he slays Agag, what he says to him is he takes Agag's sword and he says to him, by your sword, women were made childless. Therefore, your mother shall be made childless. And then he stabs him with the sword. And that's supposed to be the Hebrew sort of bringing about, right, the punctuated reiteration of sword as he stabs him. And so what you see is in terms of the grand transgression that God calls Agag, the king of the Amalekites, to task for, is that he slayed innocents. And so this is an important point because what it tells you is it tells you the God of the Hebrews is not indifferent to the death of innocents. In fact, he considers it a great evil that Agag did that. That is the thing. Of all the things the Amalekites did, and they did some stuff, that's the thing that he's going to call Agag to account for. Now, the challenge this creates is, of course, if you're sitting there and saying, well, wait a second, weren't you supposed to leave none alive? Didn't they go through and slay the innocents amongst the Amalekites? And that is the natural question. So I bring that up in order to say it is not obvious that the God of the Hebrews is indifferent to the slaying of innocents. Quite the contrary, the evidence, the biblical evidence, indicates that he is concerned with the slaying of infants, and he does consider it to be a great evil. The question we face is not a simple question of why, if the God of the Bible is good, is he okay with the slaying of innocents? It's more complicated than that. The question is, how do we reconcile what's been said about divine providence and desiring the good of people, along with what God has clearly shown that he is concerned with the slaying of innocents and considers it to be a grave evil? How do we reconcile that with the fact that it seems we have instances where he wants the Hebrews to go and slay the innocents? How do you put those two things together? Is this a contradiction in terms? And that is a very good question. Now, we have three possibilities at least when dealing with this question. One of those possibilities is simply that we're dealing with certain Hebrew idioms, ancient Near Eastern idioms that are hyperbolic. And even though that might sound improbable, you could look at the work of Paul Copan, for example. I believe he's spent like the last 10 years or so actually working on this topic. And so he's done quite a bit of work with regard to things like the Canaanite genocide and others in order to dig up not only biblical texts, but extra biblical texts in order to try to show the ways in which this language is probably hyperbolic. And it's not obvious that what is being advocated, what the Hebrews are being called to, is to go and smash the babies against the rocks or something like that. So in this first possibility, what you have is the prospect that the Hebrew idioms would lead a contemporary reader to imagine that the Hebrews are actually going in and like putting the infants to the sword or something like that, when in fact that's not what's being advocated if you understood the ancient Near Eastern context and language and so on and so forth. In other words, there is no slaying of innocents, and that's how you can go ahead and reconcile the call to go ahead and leave none alive with the fact that God is appalled at the idea that Agag would go ahead and make women childless, something like that. So that's one possibility. The second possibility is closely related. And this is something that I touched on briefly in my discussion, my last interview with Father Stephen DeYoung, who I had on the show. And in talking about these topics, one of the things that we talked about in the context specifically of the Amalekites is that a lot of these groups, like the Amalekites, were not strictly speaking bloodlines or racial groups. That's not to say that there was no sort of concept of descent. It's not to say that there was no sort of concept of interbreeding or something like that. But it was to say that the identification of the Amalekites is not primarily a genetic identification, as if you're talking about a race. And I talked about this in the previous episode, where I talked about the fact that one of the things that indicates this is probably not genocide in the way we think about genocide is that we are not actually talking about a racial group. We're talking about a certain group that practices certain abominations like cannibalism, black magic, etc., etc. And so when you're talking about the Amalekites, you are talking primarily about people who are identified by their practices. And for that reason, innocents are actually naturally excluded from that group. And so the call to wipe out the Amalekites, for example, and leave none alive could actually naturally, without any sort of question about idiom, naturally exclude the innocents precisely because they are not practicers of the sorts of abominations that have called down the sword upon the Amalekites in the first place. So that is a second possibility that once again opens the door to the prospect that the call to leave none alive does not actually include the innocents here. Now, the third possibility is actually one that comes out of my own tradition, and this has to do with the allegorical reading of these sorts of things. So I think there's a tendency amongst many contemporary readers, largely born out of the Protestant tradition, to approach the biblical text in a very hyper-literal historical way. And the funny thing is that that same hyper-historical reading is the one that you get with critics of the Bible as well. In other words, they take things in the most wooden, hyper-literalistic way, non-symbolic way, non-allegorical way, non-spiritual way, and then they proceed to identify those literalist implications as absurd and critique Christianity as irrational as a result. However, if you are familiar with the way, for example, Alexandrian Jews and then Alexandrian Christians approach the biblical text, they do not actually grant that sort of hyper-literalist way of reading it. And this isn't some sort of retconning of the biblical text where they approach it and they say, well, you know, we want to clean it up. We don't want it to mean that. So let's come up with some other meaning that we might project on this. They actually do believe this is true to the biblical text, that the nature of the genre itself lends itself to be read in certain ways. Let's give an example that's completely unrelated to the slaying of the innocents. Within the New Testament, you find, for example, the story of the Rich Man and Lazarus. And so within this story, you find this tale that Jesus tells, this parable about a rich man who walks past a poor man, Lazarus, every day, day after day, and then they both die, and they're both carried into Hades. And in keeping with the traditional sort of literalistic portrayal of Hades within Jewish lore, you can see Josephus's dissertation on Hades. This is a subterranean region, and both men are there, and one of them is being comforted by Abraham, right? He's reclining at Abraham's bosom, at his breast. And then the other one is in flame, and he's in torment, and this conversation ensues. And folks who are familiar with this, they have a tendency to read it exactly as that, right? You know, we're talking about two guys within a subterranean region. One's in flames. They envision hellfire or something like that. The other one is over there. He's at Abraham's bosom, and there's a great gulf between them such that no man can cross, because that's actually what the rich man actually says at one point, and they just accept it as this is the literal picture of what we're talking about. Clearly, this is what the parable is portraying. And the problem you have with that is that with Alexandrian readers or Eastern Christian readers, they would look at that and say, I actually don't think that is how it's supposed to be read. Now, why? Well, they would point out certain obvious absurdities. First of all, one of the things, and you could look at St. Macrina on this, right? So one of the works from Gregory of Nyssa, which is a dialogue between his sister, Macrina, and himself, Gregory of Nyssa, after the death of Basil of Caesarea, the brother of both Gregory and Macrina. They're talking about immortality and resurrection and things like that. And within this dialogue, Macrina walks through this parable. So Macrina identifies a number of absurdities that would take place if you actually accept this literally. So first of all, one of the things that she points out is that you're talking about disembodied souls, souls that no longer have a body. And yet in the parable, you have them talking about, well, could you dip your finger in some water and put it on my tongue? That's what the rich man asks. And she looks at him and says, that's clearly an indication that this can't be taken literally. He doesn't have a finger and he doesn't have a tongue anymore. Also, let's look at this chasm. There's a great gulf between them, so vast that no man can possibly cross it. And yet they're talking to each other and they're looking at one another. And so clearly, whatever this gulf is, it can't be literally something that's larger than the Grand Canyon that no person could ever traverse or something like that. This must refer to something else. And so these are the sorts of things that when Alexandrian Jews and then Eastern Christians would look at the biblical text, they understood the biblical text to intentionally give you clues like this to say, this shouldn't be read literally. And those tensions are there specifically to make you ask questions like, well, what is really being said? What is the deeper or more spiritual or allegorical meaning of this passage? And so, for example, just to use one of these, in terms of the great gulf between the rich man and Lazarus, Macrina understands it to be the gulf between the righteous and the wicked, between comfort and peace on the one hand, like Lazarus has, versus torment and despair on the other, like the rich man is having. And so there's a great gulf there. That's true. And they are irreconcilable as light and dark, but it is not a physical chasm. And so there are things like this all throughout the New Testament. We could talk about those if we were doing an entire episode on allegorical readings and the Alexandrian school of reading biblical literature and things like that. But suffice it to say that when approaching the biblical text, they believe that the biblical text was intentional in giving you things that should strike you as problematic. And those problematic tensions, those things that seem either inconsistent, absurd, or even morally problematic, are meant to clue you in that you are supposed to dig deeper into a deeper allegorical or spiritual meaning. So how does this school deal with something like the slaying of innocents? Well, believe it or not, they actually do offer an explanation. So I've already hinted at this psalm, and there's a psalm that anybody who's read it should be deeply troubled by it, because it talks about, blessed are those who bash their infants against the rock. It's a horrifying image. And when people encounter that passage, they naturally bristle and they think, man, that is brutal and savage. And how on earth could I possibly think that whoever is writing this is anything but a bloodthirsty, venge-filled monster? And yet somehow this is the word of God. Okay, so part of the question is, how are we to read passages like that? Well, the way figures like Origen or, the Cappadocians would approach a text like that is they actually interpret this primarily as having to do with the primary enemy of the soul, that is the devil and the demonic powers, and they understand the infants or the offspring of those to be the passions. So if you're familiar with the way in which the Eastern Church Fathers understand the moral structure of a human person, and if you're not, you can go back and listen to our series on anthropology, where I talk about that in a couple of different episodes. One of the things you're familiar with is they understand man to consist of a higher and a lower nature, that we have the rational spirit, and then we have this animal body. And this animal body carries with it certain natural passions. You as an animal encounter things, and as you encounter those things that strike you as either good and desirable or as somehow abhorrent or dangerous or repugnant, a certain natural evil, you recoil from them. And those sort of pre-volitional reflexes are the passions, right? They're things that stir up within you. And the understanding that you find within the New Testament and then in the Eastern Fathers is that those are the roots of sin. Now, that is not actually suggesting that your animal nature, your flesh is actually evil. It's just animal, right? Dogs have impulses that are animal, and we don't think of them as immoral, right? A dog runs off and starts to hump somebody's leg. You don't think of it as, oh, that debaucherous dog, he's such a philanderer, right? Like, you don't think that about a dog. Because not having reason and free will, the dog is actually not a moral agent. So there are no properties there, moral properties there to speak of. But if a man does that, and then he starts humping the leg of everything that walks past him, then we do think that there is something morally problematic about that individual. And so in this, what we see is that the animal nature, the flesh, and the passions are not inherently sort of blameworthy. In many ways, they are morally neutral. What happens is that the moral properties that begin to adhere to them come into play when those passions strike us and we move into action. So I talked about this actually in the context of the Stoics. I also talk about it in the context of the Eastern Fathers. The idea that there is what the Stoics would call propathia, right? These first movements of the passions that rise up. And then the thing is, what reason is supposed to do is actually assess, is this passion in accord with the order of nature? If it is, it's a perfectly acceptable thing and we can act on it. And that would be called eupathia, right? It would be a good emotion or passion. But if it's contrary to the order of nature, right, you ought not to hump that. And you act on it anyway. Now you have pathos, right? You have some sort of bad emotion, right? Some sort of passion that is sinful. And the cultivation that, the church fathers advocate for is the same thing that the Stoics advocated for. You should cultivate apatheia, which isn't to say that you don't feel anything, but it is to say that just because a passion stirs within you, you don't immediately move into action. You're capable of experiencing that passion and then assessing whether or not it should be accepted or rejected. And if you've cultivated that, right, that gap between the first movement and the action, you have apatheia, right? And that is an important feature of virtue. Now, the reason I bring that up is because the Eastern Fathers understand the demonic powers, the devil, things like that, to go ahead and tempt you by stirring up the passions, that the various whispers and suggestions have to do with the passions, that when they see the passions kindled, they do what they can in order to try to nudge you toward the right direction, or they themselves may well stir up the passions. And so for that reason, what they see, they recognize that the demons can't make you sin, but they sure can occasion a sin. And so in this sense, temptation and all the allure of the demonic actually has to do with your passions. And of course, the more you feed those, the more they grow, the more bondage you have to those, right? They enslave you. You're enslaved to the passions. Paul talks about this sort of thing. And so for that reason, the Eastern Fathers tended to look at the offspring of our enemy, which is the devil, as the sinful passions, right? And so when they're talking about blessed are those who bash their babies against the rocks, first of all, they look at any sort of fleshly enemy within the biblical text as primarily representative of the enemy, which is the devil and the demonic powers, not necessarily your brother who you are supposed to love and pray for and work toward his redemption. Instead, we are talking about the ultimate enemy, which is the devil himself and the devil's minions. And then in terms of the offspring of those, what are those? Well, the offspring of those are the sinful passions that they utilize in order to drag us into darkness and drag us away from God and cause us to sin and retreat into the wild strangeness of this world, as it were. So that's how they read the psalmist when it comes to the offspring of these sorts of things. Carrying this into something like, the offspring, any sort of picture having to do with, say, the Amalekites, you could very easily read this. Yes, on the one hand, you could read this as allegorical. On the other hand, you could also, in the same sort of spirit, you could read the offspring of the Amalekite having to do with the descendants of these, right? That what you are supposed to do is actually cut off these abominable practices, and with them, cut off the perpetuation of those practices, the perpetuation from one generation to another. Keep in mind, throughout the Old Testament, a lot of these entities, right, like things like the giants or things like the Amalekites, they get wiped out and then they come back. Why do they come back? Well, there are a variety of explanations for that, but one of the most basic and obvious explanation is kill them all, we'll make more, because they are not primarily a bloodline. They are primarily a certain mode of practice, a certain cultic ritual practice. And so you don't need to go and find the ancient ancestor of so-and-so in order to rekindle the practices of Amalek. The offspring of Amalek can emerge even now amongst people who decide to go ahead and rekindle those sorts of practices. And so in this sense, one of the ways in which you could read this allegorically is that what this is talking about is not only cutting off the abominable practices and those who presently practice it, but cut off from the earth any offspring of those practices, which is not primarily actually talking about infants who don't practice those things. We are talking about the perpetuation of those practices that needs to be terminated, never to come back. And so that would be another way of addressing it. So in all three explanations, what you're talking about is you're talking about very clear possibilities that suggest maybe there actually is no slaying of infants happening in these passages, even though the language leads us to think that. And in fact, I think all three of these are compatible. You could go ahead and actually acknowledge the Hebrew idiom. You could acknowledge that the focus is not a bloodline, but a certain practice or set of practitioners. And you could even acknowledge that the allegorical or spiritual language has to do with the perpetuation of those practices, not with the physical babies of these people or something like that. Now, I will say one more thing. I do think it's possible that there are instances in which God does take the innocents. And here I would actually point to the story of Nineveh. Clearly, God's concern for the cattle and for the innocents indicates that they actually are in the crosshairs, so to speak. If God does bring judgment upon this people, upon these parents, there are going to be innocents who end up being caught in the crosshairs, as it were. And I think that language does actually indicate that that sometimes happens. So this raises a natural question, right? It raises a natural question, and it's a question, a good question that somebody actually asked in the comments of saying, well, let's just pretend for a minute we could justify God, slaying the innocents. Let's just pretend we could somehow justify that. How do you justify God asking a man to do that, right? Because surely the psychological effect that would have on a person would be detrimental to, say, go in and kill a bunch of babies. And I'm sure that's true. Now, granted, I think we are talking about a people who probably isn't as sensitive in terms of conscience as we are. We are, after all, talking about a people like the Hebrews and other ancient Near Eastern people who had to be reminded, oh, by the way, don't burn your infants alive to Moloch. So clearly they might be a little less sensitive in the conscience than you and I are. But even still, you have another secondary question that's equally problematic. Okay, let's pretend that it wouldn't trouble the mind of a Hebrew or of any other ancient Near Eastern person to go ahead and kill a baby. Let's just pretend. Ought they be troubled by it? Right? Doesn't God want them to become a virtuous people? And in this sense, why would he ask them to go down a certain road that is actually contrary to virtue and contrary to the good? Why would he want to perpetuate that? Just because they are in some sense a blunt instrument who could go ahead and do this thing without a troubled conscience, shouldn't God be working in order to move them toward people who are troubled in conscience about that sort of thing? And I think that is actually a perfectly valid concern. So here's what I would say in terms of that worry. I would say this. First of all, I think it's noteworthy that when it comes to these sorts of objections, like the genocide objection, that the focus is typically upon the idea that God would send a human agent in order to do this. Far less often would you hear an objection about, say, the slaying of the firstborn, where God himself simply takes the life of a firstborn and decides that it's time for them to go. And in fact, I think you see this. For example, if you watch The Prince of Egypt, right, you see the slaying of the firstborn, you hear the wailing and the weeping and things like that. But somehow, as you're watching that, this idea that God might decide, these are coming with me, it doesn't have that same sort of moral repugnance that genocide does. And I think it's largely because we recognize that God is the author of life. He is the creator, if we're granting this, of course, if we're not atheists. We grant that God is the author of life, that he is the creator. We grant that all of us are going to die at some point, and we have no control over how many days we have. And so there's nothing that's obviously morally problematic that God decides that I have, 50 years, or I have 80 years, or I have 1 year, something like that. We recognize that it's tragic. And certainly within the Christian narrative, we recognize that death is somehow at odds with what man is made to be. But granting the mortality of man, this becomes less morally problematic than, say, something like genocide. And I think that's important because it opens the door to the possibility of saying, if God were somehow to actually take an innocent on his own, not ask a human agent to do it, that's less morally problematic. The real repugnance having to do with the slaying of innocents actually has to do with the idea of asking a human being to go and do that job on his behalf. And in this sense, one of the things that I would point out is if we're talking about something like Nineveh, the story of Nineveh actually never tells us how God intends to bring wrath down upon the Ninevites. And so I think it's entirely possible that what you're talking about is, yes, maybe God would go ahead and he would slay all of Nineveh. Maybe he would do it simply by raining down fire like on Sodom and Gomorrah. Maybe he would send in an army in order to kill them. He'd lift a hedge of protection or something like that. Maybe the earth would swallow up, open and swallow them all up or something like that. But I think because it is ambiguous and there is no promise that the Hebrews are going to go in and actually slay them, you have here the possibility that in this case, where it does seem that innocents are in the crosshair, that it may well be that God intends to simply take them just the same way he does in the case of the angel of death. I don't think you actually have here a demonstration that says the Hebrews are the ones who have to slay them, even if they're going to be slain. And this is where I think it's important to actually add another dimension to this. Within the Eastern patristic tradition, and this is obviously the tradition I'm part of, so that's why I'm speaking from it, there is no such thing as the damnation of innocence. So this is a contrast between the East and the West. Within the West, there is a longstanding sort of disposition born out of Augustine and then the Augustinian tradition after him, that you and I are bound by original sin, and for that reason, we are actually come into the world conceived as in some ways damnable. Humanity is a damned massa damnata. And the idea is for that reason, even from the moment of conception, right, we are damnable and objects of the wrath of God. And so for that reason, if an innocent dies before being baptized, they go to hell. And this ends up being softened within the medieval period, because even the medievals are like, man, that's pretty harsh. And they end up talking about like the limbo of infants, which is sort of a lesser hell and things like that. But there always was within the Latin West, because of the doctrine of original sin, this tendency to think that infants are damned if they die and are not baptized. Whereas in the Christian East, you don't actually have that. And you can see the stark contrast in somebody like Gregory of Nyssa, right? Gregory of Nyssa, in his treatise on infant death, basically starts off with like, well, obviously infants aren't damned. They're not even moral agents yet. So, they don't even have any sins to be damned for. And he dismisses out of hand the idea that somehow they would be damned. His question is actually, if they die and they are received into paradise, are they better off than somebody who lives a full life and then proceeds to damn themselves, right? Like, that's the question that he's actually wrestling with. It's not a question of infant damnation. That's dismissed out of hand. And that's largely because within the Christian East, there is no doctrine of original sin the way you have within the Latin West. And I talk about that in that Anthropology and Ethics series. I do an entire episode on the sort of East-West anthropology contrast. So you could see that for more details. But suffice it to say that for the Christian East, you don't have the concept that a human being is conceived in some ways damnable. And so that's one of the reasons, for example, you can find like the icon of the innocents who were slain by Herod when he is hunting for the Christ child. And it's a bunch of innocents, right? A bunch of infants who all have halos and are, embraced by Christ and the Theotokos. So in this sense, what you're talking about, if you really were to stretch out this narrative, let's just say that Nineveh were to be destroyed. And let's say that as part of that destruction, God knows that he's going to end up taking the life of innocents. I don't think anything in the narrative actually demonstrates that he intends for people to go and destroy the innocents. So it could be that, who knows, he's going to rain down fire on the people or send an army or something like that and slay the parents. But it may well be that God decides to actually take the innocents painlessly and directly himself and usher them into paradise. And if that were the case, then I think you have a far less morally problematic situation than what you have in terms of sending in Hebrews to go ahead and kill all the parents and the innocents. So that's what I would say in terms of that threat. I think largely the majority of these instances where you're talking about the slaying of innocents, you're not actually talking about the slaying of innocents for the reasons that I talked about. And in the rare instance where hypothetically you do have infants in the crosshairs, like in the case of Nineveh, I think it's entirely possible that you actually do not have God intending to use human agents to do that, because the text is fully ambiguous about that. So there you go. That's how I would address that aspect of it, which is its own sort of sub-problem and perhaps the biggest problem within the sort of genocide question. And you can see the other episode for the rest of that solution. So now let's talk a little bit about the loose ends having to do with slavery. So now, what about the loose ends when it comes to slavery? Here, what I want to do is before I jump into the loose end itself, I want to say something just about the nature of slavery and the Old Testament. The first thing, and there's two things here. The first thing that I want to say is this. I think there is a tendency, because what you're really looking at is you're looking at, Christianity in the crosshairs, this being primarily an objection, as we talked about in the first episode, this being primarily an objection from the atheist who wants to say this book can't be from God. This can't be God-breathed. And the reason is because it contains these like very clear advocacies of immoralities, right? Something like that. And so this just can't be God-breathed. And one of the things that I want to say before I go to these sorts of lingering problem passages that we might call them, having to do with slavery, is the first thing I want to say is that even though I'm going to acknowledge that there are certain things within the Hebrew Bible and the Old Testament law on this topic of, I'm going to call it servitude, having to do with servitude, that are still problematic, and we're going to talk about those. I still think it needs to be acknowledged that we are talking about something that is categorically superior to what the surrounding nations engaged in. So here, I want to make sure that we approach this objection with the proper perspective, because keep in mind, the nature of the objection that we approached from the start was to say that the Old Testament includes something like slavery. It advocates for slavery. That's always the charge. And the term slavery is never really defined, and why it's immoral is never really defined. And what I laid out for us is when we say slavery, we typically mean these 5 things. And those things are morally problematic for the reasons that I laid out. And what I talked about is the fact that Old Testament slavery actually doesn't carry inherently those 5 traits. And so what you're talking about is you are now talking about a different sort of objection. The initial objection was to say the Old Testament advocates for this. for these 5 things, this thing that has these 5 essential traits. Well, if it doesn't have that, we are now talking about a lesser objection. We're saying, okay, it doesn't advocate for this thing that we've called slavery. It doesn't advocate for these 5 traits, but there are still things within its moral law that I find problematic. Okay, that's fine, and we'll deal with that. But you have to understand we are now dealing with a lesser objection. We've actually successfully said this thing that we are calling slavery with these 5 traits is not there. Also with that, the fact that this thing we've called slavery, these 5 traits, is practiced outside of the Hebrew law. It is practiced within the ancient Near East. We are also, and we'd have to acknowledge this, when we're talking about the sort of servitude advocated within the Mosaic law, we're actually talking about something superior, morally superior to that of the surrounding peoples. And so what you don't have within this ancient world is you don't have a people group that's not practicing slavery. Like everybody's practicing slavery, and lots of them are practicing it in the abhorrent way that we described when we talked about these 5 traits. In fact, this is the story of the origin of the Hebrew people. God's people are experiencing oppression of that kind, and they cry out to God. And God says that those cries have come up before him, and that's why he sends in Moses to say, let my people go. So much like what I talked about when I talked about the fact that you have indications in the Hebrew Bible that God opposes the slaying of innocents, right? So we have here in the initiation of the Exodus that God opposes the sort of oppression that we've labeled slavery. And that opposition actually does come through within the Mosaic law. It does set up boundary lines, as we talked about, that says certain abominable practices, certain highly oppressive practices, the sort of things that we might put within those 5 traits that we used as part of our definition of slavery, those are prohibited. And so if you're going to engage in some sort of practice, it has to be something closer to servitude. It cannot be slavery the way you experienced when you came out of Egypt. And God is reminding them of that. Don't do that to another people. Now, the reason I think that's really important is because that requires a certain shift in the way that we approach the objection. The way the objection began is saying the Old Testament advocates for slavery. Now, it was a very underdefined charge, which is why I spent so much time defining our terms and exploring both what we mean by slavery and what's immoral about it. And as I pointed out, that the majority of people, when they think of slavery, they're thinking of these 5 traits. And my point in going through and showing that you can't actually find those 5 traits per se within the Old Testament, and they're certainly condemned once you get to the New Testament and the early church. But within the Old Testament, let's just stay there, that you're not finding something that fits those 5 traits. You're finding something that's closer to indentured servitude. Now, you might come back at this point and say, yes, but there's still some other things within this law, within the Mosaic law, that I still find morally repugnant or problematic. Okay, and we'll talk about that. But I don't want to brush past the fact that the objection has now changed, right? Because the first objection, or in fact that it's a totally different objection, the first objection is saying, here's this thing called slavery, defined with these 5 traits. And that's advocated in the Old Testament. Actually, now what we're saying is, okay, that's not in the Old Testament, but there's still some other things in the Old Testament that are morally problematic. Okay, 2 different objections. And I think it's important to acknowledge those. And here's why it's important to acknowledge that shift. Because if it's true that the surrounding nations and the ancient Near East was comfortable with what we've called slavery, these 5 traits, then what you have here is you have an indication that the Hebrews are actually practicing something that is morally superior. You're seeing moral progress in the fact that they are not to engage in those 5 traits. Now, it may be that the progress is still not enough for you. You look at it and you say, okay, yeah, but it's progress, but it's still not perfect. The reason that's important to acknowledge is really sort of a twofold reason. The first reason is that, as we'll see as I continue on, moral progress actually works in favor of the Christian narrative, not against it, right? And that's actually an important point that I'll return to. The second thing is that we have to recognize that when you're looking at this, if you're actually admitting, okay, it's not as bad as that other thing, but it's still got some bad stuff in there, you have to ask the question of, like, why is that morally problematic? That this is not yet perfect. It's an advancement, it's progress, but it's not yet perfect. And of course, here, I think the answer is, well, the presumption is that it is actually from God. And so if it's from God, it should be morally perfect, right? It should be morally perfect, just dropped out of the sky, perfected. And so there's no room in the narrative, in the Christian narrative, that this is divinely inspired, that God would go ahead and advocate for some of these lingering things that are remnant within the law that are still immoral. Well, let's ask whether or not that is in fact true. For my part, I actually don't think it is. I don't think the Christian narrative actually requires that you say that the Mosaic law is perfect in all things and that there are no moral concessions. Now, I did say in the first episode, in the episode where I talked about slavery, I don't buy the response that says, well, the Bible acknowledges that slavery is there, but it never endorses it, or something like that. I actually don't think that's an honest response to these sorts of things. But what I would say is this. So within the Christian narrative and all throughout the biblical narrative, what you see is a certain progression taking place. You see things that are initiated, and these are shadows of things that are to come. And with that, what begins to happen is you see a certain progression. You see the people being prepared. And as they are prepared, they move forward and they advance in terms of what God would have for them. There is a certain moral and theological and ritualistic progression. And even when Christ comes, he doesn't immediately just announce everything. He is trying to morally move people toward being able to embrace things. And in fact, even uses, with regard to, say, like the new wines and new wineskins parable that he talks about, he actually talks about the fact that the older ways that are more rigid and set end up breaking if you introduce new wine into them. So there's this understanding having to do with human psychology and the human person and the education of the human race, that this is something that takes place over a long period of time. And you actually see this in the prophets, where the prophets will tell them, okay, you used to say this proverb, you're not going to say that anymore, right? It's time for you to leave that behind and take this step forward. And the reason I bring that up is because there is something actually rather wise here having to do with moral psychology. When it comes to morality and actually trying to introduce someone to morality, the thing is that you don't actually start, when you're talking about ethics, you don't actually start from the place of, the ideal. And what I mean is this. Remember that I've talked about this in other contexts. If you're a regular listener, you've heard me talk about this in other contexts. I've talked about the problem of virtue epistemology. And one of the ways I've delved into virtue epistemology is actually to talk about something analogous in other modes of epistemology. So with regard to music, for example, if you've ever studied music, you will know what it's like to have the experience of listening to certain types of music, right? Maybe there's certain pop music, certain guitarists, something like that. And you're super enamored with it. And you think it's amazing and brilliant, and you just can't wait to learn to play that song. And then as you start to learn guitar and you get better, what starts to happen is your perspective on music and on guitar begins to shift. Right? As you change and you grow and you develop, so does your perspective on music. And all of a sudden, yeah, that riff still sounds pretty cool, but you realize it's not that hard. And all of a sudden, certain other guitarists who you didn't appreciate previously, you start to appreciate because you're seeing more clearly what you're doing. You're starting to recognize their genius. And this actually happens in any number of areas, right? With regard to art, if you've ever studied painting or something like that, you might start off and you can't see the difference between why this painting is good and that painting is bad, because technically you can't see the difference between them. And yet, as you get better and you become accustomed to painting, you grow and develop, and suddenly your ability to see paintings also grows and develop. And this is just a feature of human epistemology, that our ability to see things grows in parallel with our own growth. So as we become better at painting, We become more capable of actually seeing paintings clearer. As we get better at music, we become capable of seeing music better. And the entire point of virtue epistemology, which is something that the Eastern Fathers, they wouldn't have called it that, but they certainly agree with, is that as we grow morally, our ability to see things, see the moral fabric of reality, actually improves as well. And so when you're talking about ethics, and this is something to back into this, if I were talking about ethics with somebody who has no concept of ethics and maybe was wildly immoral, I can't sit there and begin to talk to them about ethics by using examples about very sort of finite, granular moral issues. Perhaps you have a very developed conscience. And so if I talked about, stealing a few dollars from somebody who has enough dollars that you wouldn't notice, you'd be like, no, it's still wrong. But maybe we're talking to somebody who really doesn't have a developed conscience and they're like, hey, it's not hurting anybody or something like that. In order to begin to engage in the moral conversation, you have to actually become much more morally basic. You have to figure out what are the moral lines that are left for this person. Maybe it's just murder. Maybe it's actually not, right? Like, what is the thing that they won't cross? And this is one of those sort of funny things when you're dealing with, funny, not funny, haha, but sort of funny, strange, when you're dealing with folks who have gone down a certain dark moral path, you start to realize their conscience has been blunted and there are very few moral lines left for them. But if you can find what those are, then you can begin to utilize that as a way of tapping into their conscience and nurturing a moral sensibility, bringing it back to life, assuming that they're not sort of continuing down that road. They continue to blunt it and harden their heart and, try to hollow out their humanity. Of course, they can probably get to a point where they hardly feel anything about anything. But if you're going to try to tap into something, you have to figure out where those moral lines are. And some people are very morally shallow, right? There's very little left in terms of what is there in their conscience. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I think it's important to keep in mind the nature of the ancient Near East. And once again, I talked about this in one of my interviews with DeYoung. We talked about the nature of the ancient Near East. And sometimes we sort of take for granted, because we live within a culture that has been largely influenced by Christianity, we actually live within the fumes of that. This is something Tom Holland talks about, right? Where he talks about the fact that in these Christian cultures, something has genuinely shifted in terms of our moral sort of expectations. And even for people who are not identifying as Christians anymore, there's still some of those vapors are left, right? The Christianity has still in some ways had an effect on them and lingers in the air and sets a baseline moral intuition for them that actually is not the norm throughout human history. But the fact of the matter is, when you're talking about the ancient Near East, and again, this sort of thing I talked about with DeYoung, and it's also something I touched on in the Genocide episode, you're talking about people who will casually record without blushing that, we went in and we killed this guy and then we skinned him and then we stretched his skin out on his bed and we raped his wife on it. And you're like, oh my gosh. And that sort of thing to us, when we look at it, and I think rightly, we say that is so morally abhorrent. It's shocking, right? It's like Texas Chainsaw Massacre level craziness. And yet within the ancient Near East, that is the sort of thing that would be done. And I don't say that in order to say anything about moral relativity. I say it in order to identify something about the fact that our moral faculties can be more or less sensitive. Our moral clarity can be more or less sensitive. And what you're talking about within the Old Testament, you are talking about God coming in and taking a people from that world and saying, I'm going to now teach you how to be good and virtuous. The fact of the matter is that you cannot begin that project with saying, be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. That's not where you start. To lay out the moral law and expect that they are going to adhere to it to a degree of perfection is crazy. That would not work, morally speaking. And so what you actually have to do is you have to start with where they are at and pull back the line a little bit. You can't pull it all the way back to perfection. You have to pull it back some. And this is why I say that it is important to acknowledge that the Hebrew view of servitude actually is morally superior to the view of slavery that we discussed. Why? Because it indicates that, yes, God is opposed to slavery. That comes through in the Exodus narrative. And then what he does is he pulls them back. So yes, there are going to be things in the Mosaic law that we look at and we say, yeah, that's morally problematic. Yes, okay, it's true that the mentality that says, look, if I have a servant and I give him a concubine, the concubine belonged to me. And so, I'm going to retain the concubine. I'm not giving her away. And so if, he decides to no longer be the servant, I'm keeping the concubine. Right? Like that sort of thing strikes us as wildly problematic. And I think the moral case against it is quite good. But my point is simply acknowledging that that is still, as much as it troubles us from where we are standing right now, is actually still a step forward. And that's why that thing that I talked about in terms of it being moral progress is important. And once again, I just say it again, you have to remember the world that they are part of and where you're starting from, right? Where the line is that's being pulled back. And so the very fact that we can look at the Mosaic law and we can say it's an improvement, right? It's better than slavery, but it's definitely got some problems. Okay, that's good. That's actually in keeping with the Christian narrative that suggests that what God is doing is taking a barbaric, dark, corrupt people, and he is beginning to pull them back and draw them towards something that is morally upright. And that's why over time, not only does he have real problems with this, because obviously they keep on going off and doing things like sacrificing their own children and worshiping idols and doing all sorts of craziness, right? Even though the line isn't all the way back to perfection, they still lapse into, all this other craziness. There's still this progression happening where God is calling them back and increasing those standards and preparing the way for something that actually is going to be the call. Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. And this is where I think it's actually important to acknowledge, and I do acknowledge, that there is a difference between what we find in the Mosaic law, which is not ideal, and what we find in the early Christians. So I think once you get to the church fathers and you see what they have to say about servitude versus slavery, the sorts of things that we talked about in the slavery episode, I think you actually do see now that the church fathers are advocating for the morally upright position. You've reached the point where you now are hearing the ideal. They are advocating for the ideal, and you can go see that episode for how I talked through that. And yet, is that ideal what we find in Moses? And I think the answer is no. So there is a divide. But that's indicative of the very fact that within this story, the claim is there is a progression happening. Certain people are being taken out of darkness and slowly being moved toward something more ideal until the Logos shows up, the Son of God himself shows up, and actually does say, be perfect as my heavenly Father is perfect. And now what you do is you actually see the ideal being demanded. But it took time. It took time to get the people there. And the very fact that that does end up yielding the fruit that you see in the church fathers, them advocating for the ideal across the board with the church, is extraordinary. When you look at where humanity starts and you look at that, that is extraordinary. And this is one of the reasons why I've pointed to Tom Holland before. If you're unfamiliar with his work, Tom Holland had this sort of revelation when he looked at human history. He wasn't even a Christian. He just took for granted that obviously humanity, we tend to treat each other, in a generally pleasant, upright sort of good way. And he took for granted Christian ethics, that the sort of cultural expectations that within a Christian culture, a culture that has grown out of the soil of Christianity, that's just how humans behave. And yet that sort of atheist fantasy just crumbled in his hands as he looked back on history, and he realized, no, the way humanity behaved historically prior to the dawn of Christianity, prior to Christ, actually was extraordinarily dark. And this is why the introduction of Christianity and the shift that takes place within humanity is extraordinarily notable. In fact, this is precisely one of the things that Athanasius, On the Incarnation, points out as one of the proofs that Christ is precisely who he said he is, namely that he changed the world and he changed the way humans behaved toward one another. And I think that's really important to grasp, because if you look at that, what you should expect to see is that humanity began in a very, very dark and corrupt place after the demonic power set in. You should expect that God, as he draws a people out of that and begins to try to train them to be virtuous, that it is a long haul to get there because they are rebellious and dark and corrupted. And you should expect a notable change to take place when finally the time comes where the Son of God appears. And you should expect to see that shift spreads throughout the world when the demonic powers are cast down. And suddenly you do find people advocating for the moral ideal and even living it. And that progression that I just described is, in fact, the progression of history. So that's how I address that. So I think that does wrap us up when it comes to our trio of topics: slavery, polygamy, and genocide. So with that, I'm Nathan Jacobs, and this is the Nathan Jacobs Podcast. Hey, everybody. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. If you haven't subscribed, please do so. Go ahead and hit that bell if there is a bell, and leave a comment. I hear that's great for the algorithm. And also like it and tell your friends. I really appreciate your support. And until next time.